to date. Mr. Chairman and honorable members, what I would say is that one of the changes that were made to the public management and finance law was the requirement for government to produce quarterly financial statements and to have them tabled here in the Legislative Assembly. We've had 2 such quarters presented to the Legislative Assembly already. The quarter that's ended, that will end, start again. The quarter that ended the 30th of September 2018 is due for presentation next, 6 weeks after that quarter has ended, so mid-November. So when the Legislative Assembly convenes on the 14th of November, the Minister for Finance will be tabling the third quarter results for 2018. And then honorable members will obviously be able to see what the actual expenditures, the actual revenues, the cash flow statement that shows how much cash we have, the capital expenditures as to what we have expended. All of that will be in that document to the end of September. So I can't give a precise number to the honorable member right now in terms of how much of the surplus has been used. What I can say definitively is that we all know that in the 2018 financial year, there are no borrowings budgeted and appropriated by the LA for the government to incur. So all of the expenditures of government, the day-to-day expenditures, the capital expenditures, purchasing of lands, building of roads, all of that has to be met from our operating revenues that we receive from import duties, stamp duty on land transactions, bank license fees and so forth, work permit fees. All of our expenditures in government are met from revenues that we receive during the course of the year or utilization of some of the brought forward cash balances from the previous year. So very soon, in about 2 weeks' time, honorable members will be able to see how the third quarter of this financial year has fared against the budget. The honorable member also asked the separate question about changes, I think, made to the budget, the 2018 budget. And I'll elaborate briefly on that. Honorable members will know that the Legislative Assembly approves the budget. And that gives then the government the authority to incur expenditures. Under the Public Management and Finance Law, the government does have, the cabinet does have an ability to make changes to that budget that has been approved by the Legislative Assembly. There is a limit as to the amount of changes that can be made. And that limit is specified again in the law as being equal to 5% of the budgeted revenue for the year. So for 2018, it's going to be 5% of the 731 million that I mentioned previously. That establishes the limit as to the changes that the cabinet can make. And it can't go beyond that. There have been changes. There have been changes to the budget made by cabinet for this current 2018 financial year. And again, in November, next month, the Minister for Finance intends to bring a supplementary law which will encompass those changes that have been made. And so the Legislative Assembly and Finance Committee will get an opportunity to see the extent of the changes that were made by the cabinet from what the Legislative Assembly approved for this 18 financial year. And that will be, the intention is that that will be done when the LA meets in November. In addition to that, honorable members might also remember that I think in September, there were a lot of statements that were made by ministers and official members of cabinet that explained the changes that were made to the budget by the cabinet. Again, that will happen for this round of 2018 changes. And so that is also set for occurrence in November 2018.
Thank you very much. Through you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir.
Do you know whether those statements that were tabled in relation to 2016-17 are likely to be a part of the report that we expect them to get, that we expect to get along with their accounts for that period? Or is the PAC expected to remember the explanations gave and none of it is reported in the actual report itself?
So, Mr. Chairman, I just want to clarify, you're talking about whether the statements have been included in the annual reports?
But yeah, the reports that, like how you did your report
right.
with the accounts. Are you aware whether the ministries in doing their annual report are likely or intend to incorporate those explanations that were given for the changes in their annual report for 2016-17?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I don't believe that they will. That they will be actually included as a part of the annual report itself. Even the Ministry of Finance in its 16-17 annual report did not include such a statement from the Minister for Finance in respect of the change that we did do. It's actually quite a good suggestion, I think, that the annual reports in the future actually include such statements. But legally, they have to be made in the Legislative Assembly here on the floor by Honourable Minister, an Honourable Member of Cabinet. That if their ministry portfolio incurs a change, they have to be done. And the law, obviously, the intention of the law was that the Parliament is supreme. The Parliament sets the budget, and any deviations from that budget have to be explained back to the Legislative Assembly. So the intention of the law is that if you change the budget approved by the Legislative Assembly, statements have to be made to explain what changes you have made as a ministry portfolio, and for those explanations in the form of statements to be done very quickly at the next available opportunity. So, for example, if this was a Tuesday earlier in this week, if there was such a change by Cabinet on Tuesday, and if it was the case that the Legislative Assembly were meeting today, the explanatory statement should happen today. Mm-hmm. So it's designed to give the Parliament a quick explanation, timely explanation as to changes that were made to the budget that the Legislative Assembly itself approved.
And then we also know that the ones that were done in September were basically the first time that they were actually done, to my recollection. There may have been a overarching statement by the Minister of Finance when they brought some in towards the end of the government in 2013. There were some that were tabled and weren't completed. But I just think that for completeness, particular, a member of the public picking up the report and seeing that the money for John Gray High School was moved to do something else, it would be good to have the explanation of why the priority was shifted from John Gray High School to some primary school or something else. Yes. Auditor General.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to clarify on a few points, going back to earlier with the template that the Financial Secretary has developed, I can confirm that every ministry office and portfolio did submit an annual report with their financial statements in the 2016-17 year, so that's positive. On the second and the point we're just talking about now, there were a number of ministries that had additional funding agreed during the course of the 2016-17 financial period, where the Cabinet had approved the increase but not the Legislative Assembly. So with all of those, and we've had discussions with the Financial Secretary, and I'm really pleased this year they're being done in the period in which they relate to give timely reporting back to the House. But there were a number of ministries where we raised, it didn't result in a qualification, but we raised an emphasis of matter on, in my opinion, just to reflect the fact that that budget increase hadn't actually been through the House, but only through the Cabinet. And it's really pleasing that this year they're getting done in a timely way.
One other question. In the case of when there's a transfer across ministries, who reports it? The receiving or the giver, or both?
Yeah. No, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that the most sensible approach is that both agencies actually make a statement, although I do immediately realize that the two statements might be mirror images of one another. I think perhaps the one that is receiving the supplementary funding, so an increase to their budget, would be the dominant one that would make the statement at a minimum. But there's no harm in both agencies making a statement.
Because I think it is also important to know why the ministry giving up the funds was willing to do that, whether it was because they just couldn't spend the money, or whether there was a change in government policy related around that, which drove the fact that we could take money from the school to give to the NRA or vice versa. But following up on that, you will remember the most recent case of the ombudsman and the office fit out. Is there any way you can report on whether that has been, those kind of things has been roped in? Because I just happen to have had some conversations with some of the government agencies quite recently about minor, I guess would be, well, should be maintenance expenses, but it could be considered capital. And the concern there was that there was now a mad rush to try and spend all the money that they have allocated before the 31st of December. And they were concerned that they weren't likely to get it done because the decision process that requires them to get approval, right, was so slow that even though they had a number of minor stuff, I mean, you know, in my situation, I think one of the things was a $300 expense or something, right, that was being held up, although they were told that there was still a couple of $100,000 left in the vote, right? And my concern is that we make sure that they're not hiding it away somewhere to carry it forward, or that they're not paying forward for services that they're not getting.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and certainly, sorry, it's an area that is known to the Ministry of Finance, and I think the Accountant General recently had a meeting with the CFOs, the Chief Financial Officers of most of the ministry's portfolios, and made the point that it's actually illegal. The Public Management and Finance law says that appropriations, which are the authorities by the Legislative Assembly to a ministry, to a minister, an official member of cabinet, to incur expenditure. That's what an appropriation is. The minister in turn, the official member in turn, relies on a chief officer to carry out the functions of the ministry. But it's the Public Management and Finance law actually specifies that appropriations, commonly called budgets, they lapse at the end of a financial year and they don't automatically carry forward. We have had these discussions, Mr. Chairman, and we've got representations from ministries and portfolios that for some of the larger projects, the approval process in the form of outline business cases and so forth, and the procurement process, that has pushed them to not being able to start a project until very late in the year if it gets started at all. And so the entire year's appropriation is lost, and it's a source of frustration to them. I have been requested to meet with chief officers to discuss the way forward. My initial position in a meeting with chief officers recently was to say, understand the frustration, but the legal position is the legal position. And if you come to the end of the year and your budget is unused, it's unused, and we should not. And the ombudsman is, one of the many cases. We shouldn't concentrate too heavily on the ombudsman office at all. But we should simply budget for it again in the second financial year as a supplementary in that second year, and not attempt to deliberately utilize a budget, particularly for which there's no equal and corresponding amount of work done. So if we have a budget in simple terms of $100 and we reach the end of the year and we've only got $15 worth of work done on that project, we should only utilize the $15 to the end of that year, and the 85 falls away and the project is not completed. We move into the second year and we request a supplementary to continue the project in the second year. And I think what we'll find, Mr. Chair and members, is that as time goes by, ministries and portfolios should get better and better at estimating the amount that will actually be incurred as expenditure in a particular financial year, given the procedures of outline business cases and the procurement process. Given those, they will then get better and better at estimating an amount that will actually be incurred in a particular financial year.
Part of my concern is, and it comes up in Finance Committee a lot too, is that we seem to be putting a lot of blame on business case and procurement process. But those are facts, and real and truly, they shouldn't be budgeting for stuff unless they've done that section, or at least a business case. Because how do they determine what the budget is going to be? But I kind of get the feeling that that is an excuse that is being leaned on very heavily, that the business cases haven't been completed. Auditor General.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Financial Secretary, I agree with everything he says and what the law requires. It may be worth thinking about the budgeting framework and whether it adequately allows for capital expenditure, because big capital projects generally don't all happen in a year, they happen over a period of time. And so returning budget and supplementary estimate is correct and legally required, but in other jurisdictions they roll over budget for capital projects. Clearly annual running costs you would expect to be treated separately. But the reason I did want to come in was to correct the issue around the Ombudsman, because as auditor, if money is moved in that way, we would pick it up and we would opine on it. I can absolutely, notwithstanding the evidence given to the House at the time, which I watched, there was no 500,000 transferred to Public Works in 2016-17. It was in 2018 when the work was undertaken. So I don't know why there was the confusion in terms of the witness testimony given to the House. But I just wanted to clarify as auditor that there was no 500,000 transferred to Public Works in 2016-17 from the Ombudsman's budget.
Yeah, that's part of one other question.
Yes. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, you yourself and Member Saunders are correct in recalling that when we were here last, the Honourable Minister for Finance gave an undertaking that we would request internal audit to review that particular scenario, we haven't got a conclusion to that as yet, sir.
Chairman, just for clarity, I can bring the audit opinion which explains the 500,000. I understand why the House asked internal audit. There's no need for internal audit to do anything because as the external auditor, we've already audited those accounts. So I know there's a response being prepared, but I'm just giving you the facts as the external auditor in terms of what was in our audit opinion and what we found.
One other question: the new procurement committee, as opposed to the CTC, falls under your ministry, right? Or no?
Yes, sir. The procurement regime, which has obviously been encompassed now in a procurement law, we now have a central procurement office, which at the moment consists of only 2 persons. There are plans to increase it, but at the moment it's only 2 persons. That central procurement office does fall under the Ministry of Finance. Yes, sir.
Can you say whether the actual procurement committee has been appointed by the governor, or is that still pending?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the Public Procurement Committee, which is the current replacement to what was formerly the Central Tenders Committee, it has been partially established in the sense that yourself as leader of the opposition, the procurement law specifies that the honorable leader of the opposition has an opportunity to specify 1 person to that committee. I believe you have done that, sir. The honorable deputy governor has an opportunity to specify 3 persons to that committee, and I believe he has nominated 3 persons. So that's together 4 persons of the committee. There is a need under the law for another 4 persons to be nominated by the Honorable Premier to the Governor for acceptance. So in the end, the Public Procurement Committee is meant to be a total of 8 persons. So half of the 4 persons have been nominated. I know that it is very, I understand that it's very close to conclusion that the Honorable Premier is considering his final 4, and the Public Procurement Committee in totality should be formed pretty promptly, sir.
But the law came into effect, the total of the law came into effect 1st of June, wasn't it, no? 2018?
It was either 1st of June or 1st of May.
1st of May. I think it was actually the 1st of May. Mm-hmm. So, who is doing the procurement in government now? Because once the law came into effect, the CTC no longer existed. So, in order for transitional and for proper functioning, the procurement committee should have been actually appointed before the law came into effect, or at least on the same day. So how is the government handling its procurement now, and who's doing selecting of tenders and stuff like that since 1st of May?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. There's a tier below the Public Procurement Committee, which is called entity procurement committees, which deal with a lower level of acquisitions. Right. From memory, I think it's still around the 250,000 mark. And if it rises above that, then it's the Public Procurement Committee. So some of the procurement have actually been dealt with by these entity procurement committees, which a ministry portfolio establishes from civil servants within that ministry portfolio to look at the requests being made. There have been a few projects that would ordinarily have required approval of a PPC, or Public Procurement Committee. And in the absence, to be brutally frank, Mr. Chair, in the absence of a 100% procurement committee, civil servants outside of, excuse me, outside of the requesting ministry that is seeking to acquire the goods, civil servants like myself and the director of the Central Procurement Office have performed to the best of our ability the function that the PPC would be required to have done. There's also the thought too, Mr. Chair, that if you have half the committee, could the half of the committee do the function? We haven't gone down that route. There haven't been a lot of projects in which this has occurred, and we are desperately looking forward to a fully functioning public procurement committee.
But I don't recall any provisions in the procurement law that will allow civil servants outside of the ministry at equal administrative level to replace the procurement committee.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. We don't see ourselves as replacing the Public Procurement Committee. It was a decision made that in order for the business of the government to continue, that we do this scrutiny to the best of our ability, so that the business of the government does not come to a grinding halt. I'll give you one example, Mr. Chairman and committee. The Carifta Games are scheduled to happen here in April next year. Part of that process requires a relaying of the track at Truman Borden. Obviously, and that will take some time. And we were told by the Department of Sports that, given the lead time necessary, we have to have a decision pretty promptly if Carifta in April 2019 is going to happen. Was the value of that particular project wasn't tremendously huge. It was around about $1 million US. The fortunate thing about that particular one was the IAAF told the Department of Sports here, we are only recognizing one particular supplier that can actually lay the track. And so in that particular instance, there was not much of a competition that could be entertained. So that's the best example I can give of a situation like that. But the point that yourself and the committee is making about the non-establishment to 100% is understood. And I said earlier that I believe that completion is imminent, and I do genuinely believe that.
But who is that how the port is being handled as well? That senior civil servants, other than the procurement committee, is going to decide who out of the 3 remaining tenders get, because information in the public is that decision is under active consideration for an expecting. The public has been made to believe that decision is going to be made in terms of the selection of one of those 3 before the end of next week.
Well, I can say very quickly and very definitively, myself nor the director of the Central Procurement Central Procurement Office, we are not going to be making that decision. We haven't been asked to make it. We haven't been involved in it. Mr. Chairman, there are a few projects, and I think the port is one of them, that started under the regime when there was a Central Tenders Committee in existence. And the Central Tenders Committee, the original members of those, to my understanding, will continue to have an oversight function over special projects that started under their regime, were not completed, so that there's a finite number of such projects, and I believe that the port is one such project, as well as, I think, the ISRIMS and the mental health facility, etc. So that's my understanding.
But again, my recollection of the provisions of the procurement law, I don't recall that kind of transitioning being part of the legislation. And one wonders what legal authority are they continuing on? Because if I recall, the bringing into effect of the procurement law effectively discontinued the functioning of the CTC. I could be wrong, but I will check before we make recommendations here. But because the airport, I believe, is that another project that this CTC is continuing to judge? Because I understand that there's some additional selectors of tenders that are currently taking place or have recently taken place since the 1st of May for what would probably be substantial monies, such as a taxway to be added to the airport project. So you don't have any idea of how that is being handled?
No, Mr. Chairman, I do not.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, sorry if I may interject, and certainly not to question your knowledge or guidance from the chair at all, but if I may offer a point of elucidation. On the procurement aspect, as I understand it, on the port, from the meetings that have been held in the public domain, what the CTC is expecting to receive is the final bids presented by the 3 remaining bidders, and thereafter, that should be submitted, I understand, by the end of November, and thereafter, the process of selection will commence. But what is being waited on right now through the CTC, which again, for the record, does not include any elected representative, they're waiting to receive the final bids, for which there will be a selection process, and that timeline, as I understand it, Mr. Chairman, is end of November.
The timeline is not my question. My question is, what provision in the procurement law allows the CTC to continue to function in the absence of the appointment of the Public Procurement Committee, which should have been done by the 1st of May when the law came into effect?
Thank you for that clarification, Mr. Chairman. As I said earlier, I have no challenge to that.
No. Because, I mean, I believe that this is, and I'm glad the Auditor General is here, because I think this is serious stuff. Well, yeah.
I think, Mr. Chairman, we fully understand the point being made. I don't have the procurement law immediately in front of me.
Yeah, I don't have it. But as I mean, I'm fairly certain, well, I know that I made my recommendation within days of getting the request from the governor. And I guess the problem is that those recommendations are not in consultation with, i.e., I could submit a name and he could accept it or reject it. These are done on the advice of. So he is duty bound to appoint the person that I recommended. The other disappointment from my point of view is that the person who I recommended from March has not even been contacted. And he keeps asking me, you told me you came and got CVs from me in March, and you asked me, but if I would take this appointment, and here we are approaching November, and I never got a call from anybody to saying whether, yes, I was going to be accepted or not. And when you're dealing with professional people who organize their life, that's not a good place for the government to be in. So I would ask you that to use whatever you have to contact the person that I recommended and up until last week, he was still willing, but he was getting fairly annoyed that I kept telling, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, you know?
Right.
Because he's refusing other appointments to make space to do justice to what I have tried to convince him is probably one of the more and most important committees in the government in terms of public service to his country. But in the meantime, he's refusing much more lucrative appointments to private sector boards and whatnot, because he's waiting on this. So I would just ask you to try and make contact with him.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
I will, Mr. Chairman, and sorry, sorry, members on this, just to quickly say as well that the Central Procurement Office does have the intention and training lined up for the PPC members, so that they know what their duties are. And I can also say to the committee too that I'd recently received a request for, if you like, a job description of duties and responsibilities for PPC members, what they would be asked to do, the frequency of the meetings and so forth, for the Honorable Premier to, you know, because apparently he has been getting questions from potential nominees. Well, how long, how often will the meetings be? What are my duties and so forth? So he has asked for a description of what they would be required to do. That has been provided. So I think we're pretty close.
Sir, Mr. Chairman, just so we're clear, we're a country of laws. The law came into effect the 1st of May. Across the road is a building that deals with people who don't follow the law. So the question is simply this: if the law requires X and X isn't being done, anything outside of X is illegal. You know, and we can't choose what laws to follow and what laws not to follow. You know what I mean? And this is a bigger issue. I think that this needs to be escalated now to a body above. If you have to go to the UK, so be it. But this is illegal. The law came into effect to require a certain amount of transparency and everything else, and we're not having that. We're not getting that right now. This cannot continue.
Let's change the subject. The new border control, which is a combination of customs and immigration, is that going to come under your ministry, or are you just going to be concerned with the section of customs that collects tariffs?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, my understanding is that the customs in its entirety is going to go into the new agency that will be created 1st of January 19. And so if you're thinking about, you know, budgetary matters and so forth, currently that budget for customs falls under the Ministry of Finance. And so come the 1st of January 19, we in the Ministry of Finance will have to essentially give up our budget to the new agency, which will fall under the responsibility of the Honorable Premier. So that new agency will not be under the Ministry of Finance.
Because I would, well, maybe you can address some of these things before it moves, while you still have customs. One of the complaints that I get on a regular basis is customer service in customs, and not the area of the customs officers doing their inspections, but the area of collecting revenue at the airport from passengers. In that most times there's only one or nobody there to collect the revenue, and there's a line of people waiting to pay, and I don't know if anything can be done to put more staff there and look at I made this request a couple of years ago, by the way. Look at a time in motion study, because the last time I was there, the customs officer was writing things in a book. Then he had to get up on his seat, go across to type it into a computer, right? Then he had to go another direction to get the printed page. Then he had to come back, collect my money, and go in another direction to get to the cash pan. I believe that we should be able to put him in front of the computer that has a cash pan on the bottom of it, and he sits there and completes the transaction without having to get up and down, walk up and down, and delay people.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just simply conferring. Excuse me, I will investigate further. I was just conferring and confirming that we made one small step forward, which is that the airport location, an arriving passenger is now able to pay by debit card, which
That's
is
a big improvement.
but I will investigate in terms of the number of staff there. I'm told that normally there is 2, but I do appreciate. I've actually seen the lines myself, but I'll investigate.
And now that we have moved to a system where we are relying more on people to be honest. If they be honest, we need to treat them good so they can collect the money before they change their mind on the next trip and decide to be dishonest. So if you could look into that, it would be, I think that would be a big improvement. Any other questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I definitely want to congratulate also the Ministry of Finance in terms of getting their accounts and everything outdone in time. I think I'd also echoed my congratulations when the report was first tabled in the House also. I think the timeliness of it is definitely a great achievement, and at least it allows at least this committee to function, because we can now look at more current stuff. And one of the things I just want to touch on with regards to the actual report is on page 10, which deals with the different committees and boards in which the Ministry of Finance is represented on. Now, I'm not going to call any names, but I just wanted to understand from the Financial Secretary with regards to how members of his team are chosen for some of these membership on the board, even though they're not non-voting, but rather from ex officio. One of the things that jumped out is when I look at the bigger statutory authorities, such as the Health Services Authority and UCCI, in terms of just from a governance standpoint, what is the, I guess, the mindset in terms of how some of these members are selected? Because I noticed on some of the boards you have the more senior members of the finance team, and then in others they weren't. But I just wanted to understand the governance standpoint, just to make sure from a visibility standpoint. Because the truth of the fact is, Mr. Chairman, I don't have much confidence in some members on some boards, and I think it's important that the ex officios at least play a very important role in terms of at least have an idea of what is going on some of those boards. When you consider what has happened in the past on the National Housing Development board with housing, I mean, I think one member ended up going jail for that, for fraud. And then you look at the whole issue with like with the HSA and the whole care pay, Cineco type stuff. So I'm just trying to understand the governance and the selection of how some of these, of how the nominees are selected, just from a completeness standpoint.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and through you, sir, to Member Saunders. Thank you, Member, for that question. You hit the nail on the head, sir, in the mindset in terms of putting Minister of Finance staff on boards generally reflect the relative importance of the board itself and how complex the operations of the board would be. And we definitely would we place persons of senior standing within the ministry on the most complicated and the larger statutory authorities. Excuse me, Mr. Chairman. So by way of example, myself as Financial Secretary, I sit on 4 boards. I'm the chairman of the Public Service Pension Board. That will possibly change soon, in that it creates a conflict for me, because I'm chairman of the board, but I'm also a civil servant with close links with the cabinet, and so there's often a kind of a tug of war going on. But I am chairman of the Public Service Pension Board. I'm chairman of the Stock Exchange Authority. The Stock Exchange Authority sits above the Stock Exchange Company. I am also a director of non-voting, as you said, sir, of Cayman Airways, and of the, along with the Auditor General, a member of the Auditors Oversight Authority. Senior Assistant Financial Secretaries, we have two within the ministry. One sits on the Water Authority Board, and she also sits on the Synoco Board. So that's one Senior Assistant Financial Secretary. The other Senior Assistant Financial Secretary is a member of the Port Authority Board and the Turtle Center Board. The Accountant General is a member of the UCCI Board, and the manager of the EPS unit, which I think Member Saunders referred to, within the Treasury Department, is on the HSA Board. I think, Mr. Chairman, if memory serves me correctly, that particular individual served as a past chairman of the Sister Islands Affordable Housing Committee Board, so he obviously does have fairly good experience there. He is a qualified accountant, a CPA. The Collector of Customs at the moment sits on the Airports Authorities Board. The Deputy Director of ESO sits on the Cayman Islands Development Bank Board. And the Director of the ESO is also sits on the Stock Exchange Authority. And so the member is correct in hinting and believing that the appointments on the board should reflect the complexity of the board operation, their size, their importance, and we do place as best as possible the most senior people on the largest and the most complex authorities.
What is the reason that you put senior civil servants with, obviously, because of their knowledge and expertise, but they're not allowed to vote? How does the governance of that expect them to exercise the duty with which you put them there for, to influence and to guide if they're not allowed to vote? Because I would hazard a guess that in most cases they're just ignored, and if you can't vote, you shouldn't open your mouth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do understand the questioning of the logic. What I would say that the answer to that, Mr. Chairman, would be that if a civil servant who is non-voting feels particularly strong against a particular decision that is being made, they certainly have an opportunity to speak up in such a setting, in such a meeting, and there is a possibility that they could influence the voting directors on the board. But I think the best answer to that would be that that civil servant, if particularly in disagreement strongly with a decision about to be made, would feed that position back to their honorable minister, who then would question why the decision was being made. That's the best answer that I can give, sir, in terms of the mechanics of how a civil servant who, although non-voting, do actually have an ability to influence a decision as best as they can.
So, Mr. Chairman, through you, the genesis of this question actually arose as I was going through the report, and I noticed in particular on the HSA board that the member that, as per this report, wasn't a member of the senior staff. And having been a previous director myself, when Mr. Jefferson at the time was Deputy Financial Secretary, it showed a certain level of seniority on a $100 million operation when you have the Deputy Financial Secretary there, or even the Financial Secretary, as opposed to having a member on the board which is, as per the chart, not as a member of the structure, the key person or the key management. So I was just curious from that standpoint in terms of from a risk management, because I can tell you from experience, you see Michael Nixon, you see Ann Owens on the board, it comes a certain amount of prestige, it comes a certain amount of weight, that at least when they open their mouth, or even the financial secretary yourself, it carries a lot more weight as opposed to a more junior staff. So that was the one that I'd really, as I was looking at the report, that kind of had my mind kind of start, wait a minute, I mean, why the change from previously having someone at a deputy financial secretary level or a senior assistant secretary level down to, like I said, not to take anything from them. I don't know the person who's there, but I was just trying to understand the reasoning behind it in terms of to a person who is in charge of more a reporting type for the public sector. That's what I was trying to get the thought process behind.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I do understand the honourable member's query. In terms of relative position, my first thought in terms of placing someone on the HSA board was the Accountant General. The problem with that choice was that his brother is the chairman of the board, so that couldn't work. But the person that Member Saunders is referring to, the hierarchy in the Treasury is the Accountant General at the top of the Treasury. Then there's two deputies beneath the Accountant General. And the particular person that's sitting on the HSA board representing the ministry is one beneath the Deputy Accountant General. So he has, if you, at the minimum, middle management level standing within the ministry. He is a professional qualified accountant. He's had, private sector as well as public sector experience, and he definitely provides a lot of feedback to me as to what is happening, the major plans at the HSA level. So it's those would be the considerations as to why that particular individual was chosen. He does have ability, and I couldn't put the Accountant General on it.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, one of the things on page 24 on FED 10, I noticed that there was a 856K, but there was no budget amount. So I was just curious if that was one of those that shifted pre-post elections or something. I just didn't see a budget amount for a figure that large. I'll tell you exactly. It relates to yeah, National Meal Service. So I was just curious about that one.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, through you, sir, Member Saunders is absolutely correct. On page 24, the actual cost in the 18-month period linked to the National Meal Service was obviously in respect of activities at the post office. The post office, prior to the May 2017 general election, fell under the auspices of the Ministry of Planning. The election happened, and that particular agency got placed under the Ministry of Finance. There are two reasons why the budget column shows a dash or a nil. One is that the amounts in that budget column represent the original Ministry of Finance budget, for which there was none, because it wasn't under us at the beginning of the financial year, the 1st of July 2016. And secondly, Mr. Chairman, the reallocation of budgets from, in this instance, the Ministry of Planning to the Ministry of Finance, it did happen. And it was included in that supplementary appropriation bill that the Legislative Assembly looked at and approved in September 2018. But obviously that approval happened after the end of the financial year, which was December 17. So I would say those were the two reasons why the budget column is showing nil, and the actual cost was $856,000 approximately for the 18-month period, and given rise to Minister Saunders' question about a negative variance of $856,000. But it was cleared up, albeit sometime, considerable time later, and it was given a budget of the $856,000.
Thank you for that. And just one last question I just want to touch on, and I know it's one of the things that we don't usually discuss during the budget process, and that is revenues. But in terms of, I remember in a previous lifetime where, when I was in the banking business, government looked at going after the dormant, well, I don't use the word going after, but in other words, taking a check on the dormant bank accounts. And for most banking institutions, I remember at the time, Mr. Bush was actually Premier Minister of Finance, and I remember having that discussion with him with regards to, I guess I can speak it down since I've left banking, going after that money, because in most banks, those are considered like high-risk accounts. They're monitored, and in a sense, banks were just making money, charging a monthly fee, and just taking the money out every month. And we were like, wait a minute, if the bank is going to be making money from it, why not the people of the Cayman Islands? So I remember, I think, at that time, government, I think, maybe picked up maybe $20, $30 million, somewhere along that line. One of the things I want for you to consider is the dormant pensions account. Now, I understand that that is something now that is an issue that has arisen with a substantial amount of money, where similar to the bank accounts, fees are just being charged on that. These are people that they basically can't find, they've taken off, they've returned back home. And this is not Caymanians we're talking about, this is basically non-Caymanians, and their pension account is just sitting there, and fees are just basically being charged to it. So again, now you have the pension company just making money and over, similar to what the banks are doing. And I would very much encourage your ministry, sir, to take a look at the dormant pensions account and see what we can do, because if anyone should be benefiting from people taking off and not being able to access their pensions or whatever, or when the time comes for them to look for it, I think that is something that at least the people of the Cayman Islands should be benefiting from, and not any private company. So that's just one of the things I'd just like to put out there at a minimum, and hopefully that's something that you guys can address. Maybe sometime, maybe next year or whatever.
Since the shortfall is being picked up by NAU.
Okay.
For the Caymanians, because the problem is with Caymanians who are in 4 or 5 different pension plans for a short period of time, that becomes dormant too.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank Member Saunders for his request for a future look. Under the dormant accounts law, Mr. Chairman, as you and honorable members may know, if we are talking particularly of a bank account, if there's 7 years of inactivity, the banks then are obliged to pass over the money to the government. In government, we then hold those funds in trust for a minimum of 4 years. It was, I think, at one point might have been 6, but we reduced it to 4. If there's no claim against the dormant bank account funds by the holder of that account within the 4-year period, those funds are taken into revenue, general revenue. It doesn't mean, that process though, does not mean that the holder, the bank account holder, doesn't have a recourse back to the government. It can come back in year 5 and say, you know, here's evidence that I had this account at bank X and the balance was so, could you please give me my money back beyond the 4-year period of time? And that has happened a lot. But just to agree with Member Saunders about the potential, although he spoke about pensions, in terms of bank account balances, currently right now, the government has around 13 million CI dollars from dormant bank accounts in its possession, holding, waiting for possible claims in the future, $13 million. In this 2018 financial year, if all goes well, close to 4 million would be taken into revenue in 2018. So the magnitude on dormant accounts is significant. In terms of pensions, Mr. Chair, the dormant accounts law will actually specify specifies the particular account. It's defined as account providers. So an account provider means, I'm reading from the law, sir, the Dormant Accounts Law 2011 revision. An account provider means a Class A insurer, B, a bank, C, a trust company, D, a credit union, E, a building society, or F, any other type of financial institution which is declared to be an account provider pursuant to Section 17A of this Dormant Accounts Law. So although pensions is not listed there, the Cabinet could actually specify that a pension provider is an account provider and therefore fall under the ambit of this accounts law.
Sorry, can I just get a commitment that from a ministry standpoint that you guys will take a look into the dormant pensions? Because like I said, these accounts are just, in some cases, are just being charged the normal fee. And at some point, they're just going to be charged a fee until those funds are depleted. You know what I mean? And I think ultimately, that'll be unfair to the people who may show back up 20, 30 years later thinking that they have a pension in the Cayman Islands, only to find out that, you know, fees have erased it, similar to what was happening in the banks with the dormant accounts. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I can give that commitment, sir. Obviously, excuse me, the Minister of Finance will need to work with the National Pensions Office, which has the domain over national pensions, and so we'll have to work with that officer.
Thank you, sir. Any more questions? If not, Mr. Jefferson, thank you very much, sir.
Okay.
And it's been a particular pleasure to have such a pleasant hearing here today. Thank you very much. Keep up the good work.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to you, honourable members as well.
And so for that, we're inviting you to lunch.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
We'll break now and we'll return for our administrative meeting in the committee room at 1 o'clock.